The wind howled through the narrow streets of Kambisa, carrying whispers that seemed meant only for her. Nyah tightened her coat against the chill, her eyes darting to the corners where the shadows shifted unnaturally. She had grown used to the uneasy feeling of being watched, but not by the living. Welcome to Folktales by IJ. Welcome to all my new and returning subscribers. Let's dive into some deep epic African folktale. Make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on the magic. That evening, as she walked home from the market, the feeling intensified. A soft rustle behind her made her stop abruptly. Her heart pounded as she turned, expecting to see a stray animal. Instead, there stood a woman, pale and shimmering faintly under the flickering streetlight. "Please," the woman said, her voice trembling, "you must stop him before it's too late." Nyah blinked, frozen in place. The woman's eyes were wide with desperation, her hands clasped as if begging for mercy. "Who?" Nyah managed to whisper, her throat dry. But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she vanished into thin air, leaving behind a faint chill that wrapped around Nyah like an unwelcome embrace. The sound of laughter jolted her back to reality. Two young men passed by on the other side of the road, their mocking expressions reminding Nyah of how she was seen in Kambisa. The town's resident lunatic. At home, her mother was waiting. "You're late," she scolded, her stern face softening slightly when she saw Nyah's pale complexion. Again with the imaginary beings? Nyah didn't respond. What was the point? Her mother had stopped believing her years ago, after the first incident, the one that had labeled her touched. "Nyah," her mother continued, "people are talking. You have to be careful, Nyah." "I'm not making this up," Nyah said quietly, staring into her mother's eyes. She was right there, begging for help. Her mother sighed, shaking her head. "You're just like your father, he was so dogged but he left a lot undone before he died." The mention of her father stung, but Nyah didn't argue. Instead, she retreated to her room, her sanctuary from the accusing eyes of the town and her family. As she closed the door, she felt the temperature drop. She turned, and there, in the corner of her room, was the imaginary beingly woman. "She doesn't believe you," the imaginary being said softly. "But you must believe me. If you don't act, more will die." Nyah swallowed her fear and stepped closer. "What do you mean? Who's going to die?" The imaginary being leaned in, her face inches from Nyah's. "It begins with the man in the healing center. Find him. Stop him. Before it's too late." Then, just as suddenly as before, the woman disappeared. Nyah sank to the floor, her mind racing. The healing center was at the center of Kambisa, its bells ringing every morning to mark the start of a new day. What could possibly be happening there? As she sat in the darkness, a single thought consumed her: this time, she wouldn't let them silence her. The healing center stood like a sentinel in the heart of Kambisa, its weathered stone walls radiating an eerie sense of history. By dawn, Nyah was already there, loitering just beyond the gates. She watched as the priest, the seer, unlocked the massive wooden doors. He looked up briefly, spotting her, and offered a polite nod before disappearing inside. Nyah hesitated. She hadn't been inside the healing center in years, not since the whispers began haunting her every move. Still, the imaginary being's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "Find him. Stop him." She took a deep breath and stepped through the doors. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of burning candles and aged wood. A few early risers were kneeling in prayer, their murmurs blending with the faint hum of morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. "Nyah," came a voice from her left. Startled, she turned to see the seer approaching, his kind face creased with curiosity. "What brings you here so early?" She faltered, her pulse quickening. I needed to see you. Before she could finish, a sharp chill raced down her spine. She froze, her eyes darting to the altar. There, standing behind the seer, was the imaginary beingly woman from the night before. Nyah's breath caught. The woman's expression was urgent, her translucent hand pointing toward the far end of the healing center. Is everything all right? The seer asked, concern now clouding his features. Yes, Nyah lied quickly. I just wanted to pray. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer. Take your time. As soon as he walked away, Nyah followed the imaginary being's gaze. Her steps were tentative, her every sense heightened. She reached a side door partially hidden behind the altar, its old brass handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. The imaginary being appeared beside her, silent but insistent. Nyah hesitated, her fingers hovering over the handle. What if this is all in my head? The thought gnawed at her, but something deeper, a gut feeling she couldn't ignore, pushed her forward. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A faint, acrid smell wafted up, making her gag. She covered her nose with her sleeve and began her descent. At the bottom, the air grew colder. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb swinging overhead. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty relics and forgotten artifacts. In the center, a large wooden crate sat ominously, its lid slightly ajar. Nyah approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she peered inside, she gasped. Bones. Human bones. Her knees buckled, and she staggered back, her mind reeling. Who would hide such a thing here? And why? The imaginary being appeared again, her face stricken with sorrow. This is just the beginning, she whispered. They must be laid to rest, or the curse will continue. Nyah's mind raced. A curse? The cryptic warning only deepened her confusion. But before she could ask, a noise echoed from above. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Nyah scrambled to find a place to hide, ducking behind one of the larger shelves. She held her breath as the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A figure descended slowly, the seer. Nyah's heart sank. The kind, benevolent priest? How could he be connected to this? He moved to the crate, inspecting its contents with a calm detachment that sent shivers down Nyah's spine. Then, to her shock, he began muttering a prayer, not one of salvation, but something darker, the words guttural and foreign. The air in the room grew heavy, and Nyah felt an unnatural pressure closing in around her. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Suddenly, the imaginary being appeared beside her, her face inches from Nyah's. Run, she whispered urgently. Nyah didn't need to be told twice. As the seer's chant grew louder, she bolted up the stairs, her footsteps echoing like thunder in the confined space. Who's there? The seer's voice roared behind her. She didn't look back. She burst through the healing center doors into the blinding daylight, her chest heaving as she gulped down fresh air. For a moment, she stood frozen on the healing center steps, the weight of what she had just seen crashing over her. She had uncovered something sinister, something far darker than she could have imagined. But the question remained, what would she do now? Nyah's legs carried her swiftly through the narrow streets of Kambisa, her mind racing. The image of the seer chanting over the crate of bones was seared into her memory. Every instinct told her to tell someone, anyone, about what she had discovered. But who would believe her? She slowed her pace as she reached the outskirts of town, the edge of the forest looming ahead. It was her refuge, a place where the whispers of the dead felt softer, less intrusive. The towering trees seemed to shield her from the judgment of the living. As she caught her breath, a voice called out behind her. Nyah. She spun around, startled, and saw Kato jogging toward her. He was one of the few people in town who didn't treat her like she was crazy. A childhood friend, Kato had always defended her even when it cost him his reputation. Kato, what are you doing here? She asked, trying to steady her voice. I could ask you the same thing, he replied, his tone light but his eyes searching. You ran out of the healing center like you'd seen the imaginary being. Nyah hesitated, the irony of his words not lost on her. Should she tell him the truth? I needed air, she said finally, avoiding his gaze. Kato frowned. Nyah, come on. I know when you're lying. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's not something you'd believe. Try me, he said, his voice firm. She hesitated again, but the weight of what she'd seen was too much to bear alone. I saw something in the healing center, she began cautiously. In the basement. There was a crate. Filled with bones. And the seer. Bones? Kato interrupted, his brows furrowing. What are you talking about? Nyah glanced around nervously, lowering her voice. He was chanting something, Kato. It wasn't a prayer, it was something dark. Something wrong. Kato's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Are you sure it was him? The seer? I saw him with my own eyes, she said, her voice trembling. And there's more. The imaginary being I saw, she led me there. At the mention of the imaginary being, Kato's concern gave way to skepticism. Nyah. Don't, she snapped, her frustration bubbling over. Don't look at me like that. I'm not making this up. Kato sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay. Let's say I believe you. What do you think is going on? I don't know, she admitted. But whatever it is, it's dangerous. The imaginary being warned me that more people will die if I don't stop it. Kato was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, Show me. Nyah blinked. What? The basement. The crate. If you're telling the truth, I want to see it for myself. Fear clawed at her chest. The thought of going back to the healing center, especially after the seer had caught her, made her stomach churn. But Kato's resolve was unwavering. Fine, she said reluctantly. But we have to be careful. If he sees us. We'll be fine, Kato said, cutting her off. Let's go before the healing center gets too crowded. Together, they made their way back to the healing center, keeping to the shadows as they approached. The morning service had ended, and the doors were ajar, inviting them in. Nyah hesitated on the threshold, her heart pounding. Kato placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're in this together, he said. She nodded, swallowing her fear, and led him inside. The healing center was quiet now, save for the faint creak of wooden pews as they walked. They reached the side door, and Nyah froze. The handle was smeared with fresh dirt, as if someone had recently opened it. This is it, she whispered, glancing at Kato. He nodded, his jaw set, and pushed the door open. The staircase descended into darkness, just as before. The acrid smell lingered, stronger now. Nyah's grip tightened on the banister as they made their way down. When they reached the bottom, Nyah's stomach sank. The crate was gone. What the? Kato muttered, scanning the room. Nyah's eyes darted around frantically. The shelves were still there, the artifacts untouched, but the centerpiece of her discovery had vanished without a trace. "He must have moved it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Who?" Before she could answer, a faint sound echoed from the shadows, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Cato grabbed her arm. "We need to leave," he said urgently. But it was too late. A figure emerged from the darkness, his face obscured by the swinging bulb. "Looking for something?" The voice sent a chill down Nyah's spine. The seer stepped forward, his kind demeanor replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his tone low and menacing. Nyah's mind raced. How much had he heard? What would he do to them? Cato stepped in front of her, his stance protective. "We don't want any trouble, Father." The seer's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Oh, but trouble has already found you." The seer's words hung in the air, their menace palpable. Nyah's heart pounded as she and Cato exchanged a glance, both silently calculating their next move. "You don't understand," Nyah said, stepping forward despite Cato's outstretched arm. Her voice wavered but held a trace of defiance. "I know what you're doing down here. I know about the bones." The seer's expression didn't change. If anything, his calm demeanor made him more terrifying. He folded his hands in front of him, like a teacher about to deliver a lesson. "And what, exactly, do you think you know?" he asked, his tone mockingly gentle. Nyah opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a chilling presence swept through the room. The imaginary beingly woman appeared again, her translucent form shimmering with a faint glow. She floated between them and the seer, her eyes locked on Nyah. "He cannot be reasoned with," the imaginary being said, her voice echoing in the cold, stale air. "You must act before more blood is spilled." Nyah's breath caught in her throat. The seer didn't react to the imaginary being's presence, it was clear he couldn't see her. Cato stepped closer to Nyah, his voice low. "Is she here?" Nyah nodded almost imperceptibly, her gaze fixed on the imaginary being. "What do you mean? What blood?" The imaginary being turned, her ethereal form gliding closer to the seer. "This man feeds the curse," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "The bones you found, they are the remains of the innocent, sacrificed to appease a darkness older than this town." "What darkness?" Nyah pressed, ignoring the confusion on Cato's face. But the imaginary being's attention shifted to the seer. Her expression darkened, and she raised her hand. The faint light around her intensified, and for the first time, the seer reacted. He flinched, stepping back as though sensing the imaginary being's fury. "You have no power here," he spat, his voice breaking the tension. He reached into his robes and pulled out a small, rusted object, a talisman of some sort. The imaginary being recoiled as the talisman's dull glow grew brighter. "That will not save you forever," she hissed before vanishing into the shadows. Nyah's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You're hurting people," she said, her voice steadier now. "Why? What are you trying to achieve?" The seer's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You wouldn't understand," he said flatly. "This town survives because of sacrifices. Without them, we'd all be consumed." "By what?" Cato demanded, his fists clenched. The seer ignored him, focusing on Nyah instead. "You, of all people, should understand. The imaginary beings have chosen you. They see something in you, just as the darkness does. You can either fight it or embrace it. Nyah's blood ran cold. I'd never embrace something so evil. The seer's smile returned, though it lacked warmth. We'll see. He stepped back into the shadows, the faint light of his talisman fading with him. Within moments, the room was silent again, save for the erratic thumping of Nyah's heartbeat. Cato grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the stairs. We're leaving. Now. They stumbled out into the daylight, the healing center looming ominously behind them. Cato's face was pale, his hands trembling as he raked them through his hair. What in the world just happened? He demanded. And what, was that thing you were talking to? Nyah hesitated. Cato had seen enough to know she wasn't lying, but how much could she really explain? She's the imaginary being, she said finally. One of many. And she's trying to stop whatever the seer is doing. And what is he doing? Sacrificing people, Nyah said grimly. To keep the town safe, or so he says. Cato looked like he might be sick. This is insane. We need to tell someone. Who? No one will believe us, Nyah said bitterly. They'll think we're crazy, just like they always have. Then what do we do? Nyah glanced back at the healing center, her resolve hardening. We find out where he moved the bones. The imaginary beings aren't going to let me rest until we stop him. Cato stared at her for a long moment before nodding. Okay. But we do this together. As they walked away, Nyah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The imaginary beings had made their demands clear, but the darkness lurking beneath Kambisa was more dangerous than she'd imagined. And the seer wasn't the only one hiding secrets. The sun dipped low in the sky as Nyah and Cato made their way to the edge of Kambisa. They had decided to regroup at Nyah's family farm, far from prying eyes and judgmental whispers. The house stood weathered and worn, surrounded by sprawling fields of untamed grass. Cato paced the length of the small sitting room while Nyah sat by the window, staring out at the horizon. The imaginary being's warning echoed in her mind. More blood will be spilled. We need a plan, Cato said, his voice breaking the silence. We can't just storm into the healing center again. The seer will be waiting for us. Nyah nodded absently. Her thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to her earliest encounters with the imaginary beings. For as long as she could remember, they had been a part of her life, silent observers at first, then relentless messengers as she grew older. The imaginary being in particular haunted her memory, her father. Cato, she said suddenly, turning to face him. What if this isn't just about Father the Seer? What if it's about the whole town? Cato stopped pacing, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Nyah hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But if they were going to confront whatever darkness was plaguing Kambisa, she couldn't hold back. My father used to talk about a curse, she began. He said it was why he left the healing center, why he couldn't stay in Kambisa. I thought he was just unstable. But now I think he was telling the truth. Cato sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. What kind of curse? Nyah took a deep breath. He said the land was cursed by something ancient. Something that demanded sacrifices to keep the town from falling into ruin. He believed the healing center was part of it, that they were the ones making the sacrifices. Cato's eyes widened. And now you think he was right? I don't think, Nyah said grimly. I know. Cato leaned back, rubbing his temples. This is bigger than I thought. If the healing center has been covering this up for years. They have, Nyah interrupted. And we have to find proof. If we can show the town what's really happening, they won't be able to ignore it. Cato nodded slowly. But where do we even start? The seers already moved the bones, and we don't know where. Nyah looked out the window again, her mind racing. That the imaginary being had said the curse was tied to the bones, they were the remains of the innocent, sacrificed to appease the darkness. If the seer had moved them, it had to be somewhere significant. The crypts, she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like a thunderbolt. What? The old crypts beneath the healing center, Nyah explained. They haven't been used in decades, but I remember my father saying they were built to contain the past. If the seer's hiding the bones, that's where they'll be. Cato's expression darkened. And let me guess, the crypts are locked up tight. Probably, Nyah admitted. But I know where the entrance is. We just need a way to get in. Cato tapped his chin thoughtfully. I might be able to help with that. There's a locksmith in town who owes me a favor. Nyah raised an eyebrow. A locksmith? What have you been up to, Cato? He smirked. Let's just say not all of us walk the straight and narrow. For the first time in days, Nyah managed a small smile. It faded quickly, though, as the weight of their mission settled on her shoulders. Meet me back here tonight, Cato said, standing. We'll head to the crypts under cover of darkness. Be careful, Nyah said, her voice softer than she intended. Cato hesitated at the door, his usual bravado giving way to something more serious. You too, he said before disappearing into the twilight. As night fell, Nyah prepared for what lay ahead. She packed a small bag with essentials, a flashlight, matches, and a worn notebook her father had left behind. Flipping through its pages, she found scrawled warnings about the entity and the price of defiance. The final entry made her shiver. They will come for you, just as they came for me. A soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Cato, a crowbar tucked under one arm and a small satchel slung over his shoulder. Ready? He asked. Ready, she replied, though her hands trembled. Together, they set out toward the healing center, the streets eerily silent under the full moon's glow. As they approached the center, Nyah felt the familiar chill of the imaginary being's presence. The imaginary beingly woman appeared once more, her expression grim. You are running out of time, she said. He is already preparing the next sacrifice. Nyah's blood turned cold. Who? The imaginary being hesitated, her form flickering like a dying flame. An innocent. A child. You must stop him before the darkness consumes another soul. Nyah and Cato exchanged a horrified glance. There was no turning back now. Lead us to the crypts, Cato said firmly. The imaginary being nodded, her translucent figure gliding ahead as they followed her into the shadows. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the healing center grounds as Nyah and Cato followed the imaginary being into the shadows. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. Every step seemed to echo through the stillness of the night, the weight of what they were about to uncover pressing down on them. The imaginary being led them around the back of the healing center, past the crumbling stone walls that had long since been overgrown by ivy and moss. They reached a secluded corner where an old iron gate, partially concealed by vines, marked the entrance to the crypts. Cato examined the gate carefully. It's locked, he muttered, inspecting the rusted chains and padlocks. But I think we can get in. Without another word, he produced the crowbar from his bag, wedging it into the rusted links. With a grunt, he pried the lock open. The metallic clang of the chains falling echoed in the still air. Nyah held her breath, her eyes darting nervously around them. We need to hurry, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. If anyone sees us. We won't be here long, Cato replied, his tone focused. He pushed the gate open with a low creak, revealing a set of narrow stone steps that descended into the earth. The imaginary being hovered at the top of the steps, her form flickering as she beckoned them forward. "This way," she said, her voice distant and hollow. "Hurry." The darkness grows stronger. Nyah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she stepped forward, Kato close behind her. The air grew colder with each step they took, the walls of the crypts pressing in on them. The stairs spiraled downward, and the further they descended, the heavier the silence became. At the bottom, they found a long hallway lined with faded, ancient carvings. The dim light from Nyah's flashlight barely illuminated the stone walls, which seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The imaginary being had stopped at the far end, hovering near a heavy wooden door. "This is it," she said softly, her eyes locked on the door. "Behind it lies the truth you seek." Kato stepped forward, his hand resting on the door's iron handle. It was cold to the touch, as if it had been untouched for centuries. He pushed it open with a creak, revealing a large, cavernous chamber. The sight inside made Nyah's breath catch in her throat. The room was filled with piles of bones, human remains, carefully arranged in macabre patterns. The bones were old, their surfaces worn smooth by time, but what stood out the most was the large, altar-like structure in the center of the room. On the altar lay a fresh, recently constructed sacrifice, a young child, her body pale and lifeless. The imaginary being's warnings rushed back to Nyah's mind, and she felt her stomach churn. "No," she gasped, rushing toward the altar. "This can't be happening. This is wrong." The imaginary being's voice echoed again, mournful and filled with regret. "The child is the last of many. And the darkness is always hungry." Kato moved swiftly, pulling Nyah away from the altar. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they turned to leave, the ground trembled. The walls of the crypt began to shake, and a low growl, deep, guttural, rumbled through the earth beneath them. Nyah's heart raced as the air grew thick with something dark and unnatural. "Too late," the imaginary being whispered, her form flickering as though it were being pulled into the shadows. "The curse has been awakened." Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway, casting a long shadow across the room. Nyah's blood ran cold as she recognized the tall, imposing figure of the seer. "I warned you," he said, his voice low and dripping with malice. "But you refused to listen." Kato stepped in front of Nyah, his fists clenched. "You're behind this. You've been sacrificing children." "Why?" The seer's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Sacrifices are necessary to keep the darkness at bay. Without them, this town would fall into chaos. You wouldn't understand, but I don't need you to. You've seen too much already." Nyah's mind raced. She had to stop him. If the town had been under this curse all along, it meant there was more at stake than just her, and now Kato too. "You think this is just about the curse?" Nyah said, her voice trembling but fierce. "This is about power. You're feeding something dark, something evil, and it's feeding on innocence." The seer's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know anything. You're just a girl, haunted by the imaginary beings. You cannot defeat what has been in power for centuries." "Maybe not," Nyah said, her voice steadying as she reached into her bag. She pulled out the notebook her father had left behind and opened it to a page she'd skipped over before. There, in her father's handwriting, were the words, "The blood of the innocents will awaken the true power of the curse. The key lies in stopping the sacrifice." Nyah's eyes widened. Her father had known. He had found a way to end this. "We're not alone," Kato said, his voice suddenly tense. "Something's coming." The ground shook again, and the walls of the crypt began to crack, the ancient stones splitting as a dark, swirling energy began to materialize before them. A shadowy figure rose from the altar, its shape shifting like smoke. It was not the imaginary being, but something far worse, a dark entity, born from the very sacrifices the seer had been making. The seer stepped back, his face pale as he watched the creature form. "No," he whispered, his voice faltering. "It's too late." The creature's voice echoed in the crypt, a booming, ethereal growl that rattled the bones of the dead. "You awaken me," it hissed, its shape fully formed now, towering over them. "And now, you will all serve me." Nyah's pulse quickened. This was it, the thing her father had warned about. The very darkness that had been feeding on the town for generations. "We have to stop it," she whispered to Cato, fear and determination in her voice. "Together." Suddenly, something in Nyah's hand caught the dim light from the flashlight, a Bible. She held it up, her heart racing as she scanned the pages, desperate for a solution. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, speaking of the blood of Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice. "You were bought with a price," that meant people who believed in him no longer belonged to themselves, but to Christ. Those were her mother's voice coming to her. Nyah had heard this as a child, but now, the weight of those words felt different. The work her father had started, but never completed, was supposed to break the curse. Yet, it had one missing piece. "The key is here," Nyah whispered, her fingers trembling as they traced the faded words in the notebook. "I just need to figure out the last part." "What key?" Cato asked urgently, confusion in his voice. "What's in that book?" "It's a work," Nyah replied, her voice tight with fear. "It's supposed to banish the darkness, but my father never finished it. He couldn't find the last part." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with urgency. "We need to finish it. This is the only way." The creature's growl echoed in the chamber, its twisted form advancing with an unnatural speed. "You cannot stop me. I am eternal." "You are nothing," it snarled. Nyah steeled herself. "Maybe not, but we still have something you don't," she declared. The words came not from her own strength, but from something deeper, something she could feel rising within her. She wasn't alone in this. She turned to Cato. "Help me find the last part. We have to finish the work." Cato's eyes locked with hers, his face hard with determination. "I'm with you." As they desperately flipped through the pages, Nyah's mind raced. She remembered her father's last words. He had spoken of the heart of the cursed, of the child, the sacrifice on the altar. Her breath hitched as she looked at the lifeless body of the child. That the imaginary being had spoken of it, the curse demanded innocence. But Nyah realized something crucial: the blood had to be cleansed, and the source had to be confronted. The child was the source. Her heart pounded, and a sense of clarity flooded over her. She knew what had to be done. "Cato," Nyah said quickly, her voice steady, "we need to take the child's body away from the altar. It's the source. The heart of the curse is tied to the blood." Cato nodded without hesitation. "Let's do this." Together, they approached the altar. As they lifted the child's body, the creature shrieked in fury. Its tendrils lashed at them, but Nyah felt something surge inside her, a power, a protection she had never known. The walls of the crypt shook violently as if resisting their every movement, but she stood firm. "No," the creature howled, its form writhing in anger. "You cannot remove what is mine." But Nyah and Cato didn't stop. They carried the child's body to the far side of the chamber, to the stone circle carved into the floor. The markings on the floor matched those in her father's notebook, and her heart quickened with anticipation. "This is it," Nyah whispered, placing the child's body in the center of the circle. She glanced at the notebook once more. The work was simple but demanded absolute focus. The time had come. Cato held the flashlight steady, his eyes burning with an intensity Nyah had never seen before. She took a deep breath and began to chant the words from the Bible. As she spoke the sacred words, her voice trembling with the authority of someone who had just encountered the living God, a strange peace filled her. The symbols beneath the child's body began to glow faintly. It was as though the very air responded to her words. The creature's roar filled the crypt. "You are too weak to defeat me. You cannot banish me," it screamed in fury. But Nyah felt something shift within her, as though her voice had become the very weapon to defeat the darkness. The power of the words, the power of God, infused her, and she continued to chant. The room shook, but Nyah's voice only grew stronger, louder. With a final, powerful declaration, Nyah shouted the last words of the work. The crypt fell into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the creature's form began to dissipate, as if it was being consumed by the light. The shadows that had long oppressed the room lifted, and the air grew lighter, free from the suffocating darkness. The child's body dissolved into a gentle light, the innocence once trapped within now freed. Nyah stood, heart pounding, knowing that something inside her had changed, had been transformed in that moment. And then, she saw him. The seer stood at the threshold of the chamber, his face pale and stricken with guilt. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto them, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. I didn't know it would end like this. I thought I was protecting them." Nyah walked toward him, her eyes unwavering. "You let the darkness control you," she said, her voice firm but not condemning. "But it's gone now. The power of God has overcome it. And now, the town will be free." The seer's gaze met hers, and for the first time, he saw the truth. The power of God had set them all free, not just from the curse, but from the darkness that had clouded their hearts. He wept, but now, his tears were for redemption. Cato stood beside Nyah, his face soft with relief, but also with a deep respect for what had transpired. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's really over." And in that moment, Nyah knew that the darkness had not only been banished from the crypt, but from their hearts as well. They had all been transformed, encountering the Almighty in a way they would never forget. The crypt was silent, the last remnants of the creature's power melting into nothingness. Nyah stood at its center, a deep calm washing over her. The horrors of the past had been faced, but there was still much to be done. The imaginary beings who had tormented her, whispering their unfulfilled anguish for so long, now stood still in her mind. They were waiting, not for vengeance, but for the peace that had long been denied to them. Cato stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Is it really over?" he asked, voice filled with uncertainty, still haunted by the darkness that lingered even in the air. Nyah turned her gaze to him. "It's over," she whispered, feeling a lightness that had once seemed impossible. "The curse, it's broken. But there's still one more thing we need to do." The seer, kneeling by the altar, finally raised his head, his eyes hollow with regret. "The children, the sacrifices." "I don't," Nyah interjected, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "You've been living in your guilt for too long. You knew what was happening, and yet you let it continue." She paused, her gaze hardening. "But it's not too late for you. Redemption is still possible, for all of us." The air shifted as a familiar presence entered the crypt. Nyah's heart skipped when she saw the figure standing in the doorway, her mother, Grace, poised in calm, the years of hardship and wisdom etched in her face. Her mother had always been the pillar of their family, and seeing her now, after everything Nyah had endured, was a silent reassurance. Grace's voice broke the stillness. "You've done well, Nyah," she said, her tone both proud and sorrowful. "But remember, redemption is not a single moment, it's a journey. One that requires humility and honesty." Nyah turned to her mother, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "How did you know we were here?" she asked softly, unsure whether it was curiosity or the overwhelming emotion that made her voice tremble. Grace stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the group. "I didn't need to know where you were," she said simply. "I've always prayed for you and I have always known the path you would take. You carry a light within you, Nyah. A light that even you didn't believe in until now." She looked at the seer, her eyes steady, unyielding. "You've caused unimaginable pain, but that doesn't make you beyond redemption. Redemption comes through truth, through facing the weight of what you've done, and seeking to make it right. It is a journey, Father." The seer looked down, shame overtaking him as he whispered, "I've wronged them all, so many innocent lives taken for my selfish desires." Grace's voice softened, but it was full of the weight of a truth only someone who had lived through hardship could speak. "We are all capable of doing terrible things. But it is not what we've done that defines us. It is what we choose to do with what we've learned. The path to redemption is not easy, it requires confronting the truth even when it's painful." The seer lifted his head, his face pale but determined. "I will speak to the people," he said quietly. "I will tell them what happened, and I will ask for their forgiveness. I know it won't be easy, but I will do it." Grace nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. The truth will set you free, Father. But you must face it fully, without turning away." Nyah, who had been silently listening to the exchange, felt a strange sense of peace settle in her heart. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, and the weight of her past began to lighten. She had spent so much time running from her visions, fearing that the imaginary beings that whispered to her, calling her mad. But now she understood, the imaginary beings weren't just shadows of the past, they were the voices of the forgotten, the wronged, and the unacknowledged. They were the souls who had been trapped in the darkness of the town's sins. Turning to the seer, Nyah spoke with newfound strength. "These the imaginary beings, they're not just victims. They're your victims. They are the ones you sacrificed, the ones whose pain you ignored. They are the reason for the curse, for everything that has happened." The seer shuddered, the weight of her words hitting him like a physical blow. That the imaginary beings, the spirits that had tormented Nyah, were no longer just phantoms of her imagination. At some point, the truth needed to be told. They were bound to the town because of his actions, his decisions that had sealed their fates. The seer's expression shifted, as though something inside him had finally clicked. The tears that welled in his eyes weren't just for the guilt he had carried, they were for the lost souls, the children he had betrayed. He slowly stood and faced the altar once more, his voice trembling as he muttered a prayer, an apology. He was too weak in spirit to mutter clear words. Nyah stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "I always sensed that something was amiss, but no one believed me. The truth needed to be told." Cato, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his voice soft. "But what about me, Nyah? I helped you, but I wasn't part of this. I'm just an outsider." Grace looked at Cato with a knowing gaze. "You've been more than an outsider, Cato. You've been a guide, a companion, a light in the darkness. You chose to stay with her when everyone else turned away. That, too, is part of redemption. It's not just about the wrongs you've done, but about the right you've chosen to do, even when it was hard." Cato looked at Nyah, a tentative smile breaking through his uncertainty. "I didn't think I was part of this story. But maybe I was meant to help you find your way." The room grew still as the weight of those words sank in. Redemption was not a single act, it was a collective process, a journey of healing, of facing the past and choosing to move forward. That the imaginary beings Nyah had seen were no longer just wandering spirits, they were reflections of the town's own guilt, the wounds left by its own actions. Their presence had been a reminder that the past must be faced for true peace to come. As Grace spoke again, the first light of dawn began to filter through the crypt's narrow windows, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The sun rises, and with it comes the promise of new beginnings. You've done the hard work, Nyah. Now, together, we will walk into the light. The seer nodded, a quiet resolve filling him. We will face the people. We will ask for their forgiveness. And together, we will heal. Nyah stood tall, her heart no longer weighed down by fear or uncertainty. That the imaginary beings had been released, the curse had been broken, and redemption had been claimed, not just for her, but for the entire town. The road ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs to walk, together. As they left the crypt, the light of a new day stretched across the town of Kambisa, casting away the shadows of the past. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the past would not be forgotten, but its burdens could finally be laid to rest. Thank you, besties, for watching. Please like, share, leave a comment and subscribe to Folktales by IJ.